support. Having looked at the list of attendees, I don't think we have any IPSO applicant organisations with us this morning, so we'll focus on the main NPO process, knowing that IPSO is a little different. But if anyone has any questions regarding the IPSO process, please do just let us know and we'll try and address those, of course. The first thing that I think we'd want to say is that this process is the most complex one that ACE have used to date. And I think that's a very important note at a time when we're thinking very much about inclusion, we're thinking about making sure that the full range of organisations and scales and locations are able to apply to this process. It clearly draws on the experience that ACE has had in programmes such as the Cultural Recovery Fund and also the CPP programmes, but it isn't the same as those processes. At Achates, we advocate for an audience-informed approach, and we use tools such as theory of change to help organisations develop a rigour to their programmes. We know that creatives don't start with theory of change, they start with ideas. But we think that this approach tests and helps to ensure that programmes are as well designed and as reflective of the priorities of your communities as possible. So it's a great place when you've got an idea to start to stretch and test it and see if it's got as rigorous a programme design as you can have. In preparing our clients for this process, we've gone through an initial journey of looking at statements of purpose, which we find are more suitable to cultural organisations generally than vision and mission, which tend to be suited to more mainstream charities because of their binary nature. We then help organisations think about their priority audience segments and then think about the types of value they're driving. I'll speak a bit more about this in a moment. And then look at developing both logic models for single programmes and an overall theory of change to underpin this process. If you haven't already gone through that process as an organisation, it's one that you might want to think of just to check back in terms of the programme design that you're putting forward. As you all know, and we talk about it all the time on Achates Live, the majority of trust and statutory funders have adopted a theory of change-based approach in recent years. And the level of rigour that they now want to see has increased exponentially, particularly since COVID. And this is in terms of a deep understanding of those priority audience segments, their priorities or needs, as you may prefer, the change you are bringing for those audiences and the outputs and the outcomes that will bring within the context of the purpose of the organisation. ACE has been slower to date to adopt this kind of approach, and the NPO process is complicated by the fact that Let's Create seems to have been written before the application process was designed, meaning that language that you may be familiar with from using with theory of change is not used in a consistent way. And that certainly seems to be one of the principal areas of confusion that we've come across. So with that context in place, let's move to look at the activity plan. I'm going to start by saying that the activity plan is perhaps my least favourite attachment in the NPO process, and maybe of all time, because the initial version that ACE posted crashed my computer so many times that I thought I would need a new one. So at Achates, we have made a very simple template that you might want to think about. You may be already past this stage, but you might want to think about something like this in the early stages of developing your activity plan. We simply did this because we thought it was better to work offline. Now, this doesn't help you with letter counts, etc. So when you get to the more detailed stage, you're probably going to want to think about moving on to the form. But in early stages where you're thinking about strands, as I'll explain, something very simple like this may just be easier to work with offline. As you know, the aim here is to list up to 10 activities or strands of activity, as it generally is for our clients, which you will deliver in the first year, 23-24 of the programme. Each of these activities sits in one of the 3 outcome areas, and they are people, they are community, or they are country. So let's just think about those 3 elements. First of all, here they are. Let me try and make them a little bit bigger for you. Oh. Even on our form, it plays havoc. Okay, let's try and zoom down a little bit and move across. There we are. So it's very interesting to see this definition of elements, and I think that that's clarified for a lot of us, perhaps some of the detail that wasn't there in Let's Create. I find it easiest to think about these three outcomes as follows. Country is perhaps the traditional role of the arts organisation, making great art, international programmes and touring, sector leadership and development. And if you've been in the portfolio for a while, it's very likely that one of the things that you'll be looking at is the outcome of Creative Country. People is a sort of activity that was introduced around 30 years ago to the cultural sector. Primarily, it focuses on the engagement of children and young people in culture, but also includes elements such as talent development in H. So there's a really interesting separation between developing and improving pathways towards careers in the creative industries in H and how that fits in Q&R when you're at perhaps a more professional level when it comes to country. I'm just going to make a point here about community, and that really this is where the more recent strategic policy development of culture playing a key role in people, place and well-being that all the lottery funders now hold, and it's the basis of most cultural strategies across the UK. Really the idea of culture as regeneration within specific communities and localities that has particularly been accelerated through COVID is really what this middle section looks at. I want to make a point which is related, which perhaps is the subject of a different webinar, which is when you look at the new National Lottery project grant, essentially you are expected to really use these elements even though they're not included in the guidance specifically. I think that we're certainly advising our clients that when you talk about which of these outcomes that you're related to in the NLPG process, I would still use these element headings, just as I would also use the language of ACE here in NPO in terms of outputs and targets and success measures in that process. But as I say, it's a slightly different point. I think the first thing we want to say here is, what role does ACE want you to play in the portfolio? It's a key question you should be asking yourself. Why would they invite you in? What's missing from the portfolio in the vision of Let's Create that you can bring? As I've said, if you're an existing NPO, it's likely to include country, but unlikely to focus solely on this outcome alone. If you're a new applicant organisation, the emphasis is very likely to focus on community, and particularly if you're representing an area or community which is underserved. If you're located in a priority place or work with an underserved group, that is a key asset which ACEs likely to want to include in the portfolio, and you must position yourself through that lens. As the guidance notes, the number of outcome areas you need to address is related to the size of grant you're requesting, and ACE would rather see you address one outcome well than address too many poorly. We are recommending that clients use all 10 activities if they can, and that they consider their balanced distribution across the chosen outcome areas, and at a minimum have 2 activities for each outcome they're addressing, and really, ideally, at least 3. This means that you may be addressing the full breadth of your activity to ACE for the first time if you're a larger NPO that's been in the portfolio with ACE just targeting a specific element in the past. It may also mean that you're having to condense activities into strands to make the work fit if you're a larger organisation. You may need to present those strands in a different way to the way you have thought about them internally in the past for them to be clear and to make the most impactful case to ACE. They certainly shouldn't be by funder. One of the issues we are aware of is that there is the possibility of ACE picking which activities they want to have associated with their funding, and this might inform how you position your strands. We have seen some organisations overlook the inclusion of the artistic programme, and it's really important to think about your work in a holistic way. This is about all of your activity, with the hierarchy between ticket buyers and engagement audiences dissolved. Artists are probably one of your priority audience groups. They just aren't the only one. One of the challenges that we see cultural organisations face is that just as they need to be open to all, but put particular energy and resources into making a commitment to specific prioritised audience segments, which you need to be able to articulate, so you need to think carefully about the types of value that you are driving. And I want to be clear here that what I mean is types of value, not values. So one of the things that we use as a tool to help organisations structure their thinking is something that we developed through the 2020 Achates Prize, where we produced 120 case studies of good practice in terms of the work that cultural organisations were doing in their communities and the value it brings. This was particularly important because it came at a moment when the Creative Industries Federation and DCMS were particularly making an argument about the economic value of the arts in isolation. And whilst we at Achates really believe that economic value is essential, we also believe that it's only one type of value and we should count and celebrate them all. Very briefly, I would say that the first two types of value that applies to the work that every single one of you are doing, every project has intrinsic value, if it's of any cultural or artistic merit. And if you're paying people in any way, you'll have economic value. So these two are a given. Of course, the focus has ended up on economic value because of the focus of the current government, but also because of the long-standing tensions around how you quantify and value intrinsic value. The other 6 areas, just as with audience segments, you won't be able to drive them all effectively, but it is useful to think about which ones you're specifically working towards, because that can produce a really useful frame of argument in thinking about which outcome areas and which types of element you're identifying, and you can use it to really make a condensed argument in your narrative as well. So mental health, there's a real sort of sliding scale here between well-being and mental health, I would say. Perhaps be really clear about which of those it is you're doing. Physical health is a really good illustration of the fact that not all types of value are available to all types of organisation. Physical health is particularly suited to dance companies, for example, and perhaps less so to literature. Social benefit, I would say this is perhaps particularly thinking about issues such as employability, pathways to the creative industries. Community building is less about saying we're in a room together watching a production. That's a shared experience, undoubtedly is, but I would not say it was a community. It might be about the work that goes on beyond that production, or your work in a specific locality. So communities of interest or communities of place, and how you are actively supporting them in coming together. Innovation, I don't mean that you've got a lovely set design or that you're using lighting in a different way. I mean genuine technological innovation, which is the way in which ACE uses the term in the NPO process. And finally, educational, lots of you will have this. So this is working with informal educational settings. So you should select, you'll definitely have these two, but which of these types of value are you driving, and use that to help structure your thinking and your approach. One of the main areas that I think we need to think about in terms of thinking about the type of value you're driving is which elements you're particularly prioritizing. I would argue that you shouldn't tick the box for an element if you can't prove that you're delivering that element. So there should be a success measure for every element that you are ticking the box for. And you really want to, perhaps when you've done that, go back and check through. Now, a word or two on the main, on the key issue which we are seeing organisations struggle with at the present time. And I'll just move to the main form at this point. Here we are. I managed to open it, which is the first victory. Outputs and success measures, and the difference between the two. In outputs, you need to describe the programmatic activity or output of the strand of activities. So what I mean by that is you're probably going to have a heading that says exhibition, 2 venues, 10 open days, X number of programs that sit with it. And for the targets and success measures, you want to really define the outcomes for people. So this might be 100 attendees of that exhibition, and it might be the percentage shift in attitude to culture, their attitude about the area. And of course, those targets and success measures, as I say, should really be proof of the elements of the outcome areas that you're proving. So these are outputs in a programmatic sense and should not only include the headline, but the breakdown of the elements within that headline. And these should be the impact, particularly on people and the change that you're bringing about. The key issue in terms of success measures is, of course, that monitoring numbers is much easier than monitoring the change you've brought about. And you really probably do need baseline data in place in order to be able to monitor that. If you don't have baseline data, you might want to look at a percentage shift and indicate within the investment principles that you're going to be doing some evaluation and baseline work in the year ahead, so that that's in place. I think the final point I want to make here is about scalability. If you're applying for an uplift, there is a specific question on the application form, of course, as Helen will talk about, to address this, but this has a very limited word count. Some organisations have managed to contain any additional programmes they would deliver within an uplift within a single strand, but that's quite rare in our experience. This approach only works in specific circumstances. For the majority of organisations, it's a question of enhanced outputs and targets of existing programmes. ACE suggests that you ensure that programmes are clearly scalable, so that targets you're established are at your current grant level, and if you were to get 50% more funding, you would increase that out, the targets and success measures, by 50%. However, one of the things that we are working with our clients to do is to use impact philanthropy messaging in this regard. So you'll all know impact philanthropy from how you communicate the impact of a donation. So £10 could enable this. Well, equally, you may want to think about impact philanthropy here in terms of an enhanced investment leading to greater targets and success measures. And so if that's the case, we would suggest using a little heading of current and then saying what your targets and success measures were, and then uplift to show that scalability. Finally, a brief word on geographic locations. If you're committing to a specific location, I would suggest that you either should have already delivered work there or have an established partnership that you can name in the bid. Otherwise, your position is more exploratory, and that's how you should position it within the form. Right, now I'm going to hand over to Fiona to look at the investment principles attachment. Thanks, Fiona.
Thanks, Caroline. So moving to the investment principles. So assuming that you've already looked at this template, although we will dive in a second, really the question that you're trying to answer with this form is, how will you help in a quantifiable way the Arts Council to achieve their 2010 to 2020 vision, 2022, sorry, to 2030 vision. And so really in all of this, the 4 pillars that sit in the investment principles are the aims that you're helping them to look at. And so these are simply ambition and quality, environmental responsibility, dynamism, and inclusivity and relevance. And we'll unpack these a little bit more in a second. This isn't actually something new, even though this form and this way of applying is quite new, but they have been talking about these pillars for quite some time. There's now just a focusing on how your unique organisation can bring this vision about on behalf of the Arts Council in partnership with the Arts Council. If you're doing this right, then I would say that the investment principles should actually form a bit of an overlapping to the other things that you'll be writing about in both your activity plan and your application form, rather than writing about things that are totally new for the first time, although obviously there'll be some specific examples that you're making that you won't be covering elsewhere. And in general, I would ask yourself, rather than thinking about this purely from an organisational point of view, I'd go through the form thinking about, is there something that you can do for audiences or the groups that you work with, your staff and your board, so that you're looking at all three of those throughout and constantly thinking how you can bring about transformation in each of those areas. A little note on the form, there is obviously this opportunity to say work that is established, in progress, or is brand new that you're thinking about. And we would recommend that there shouldn't be many points that you're making that are established already. This is about the Arts Council investing in change rather than already seeing what you have done. And so this form is very much about the future of where you're going, and both your 1-year plan and then, of course, some headlines on your 3-year plan, rather than what you have already done. So I'm going to share my screen and just take you into the form. So hopefully this will be familiar to you already, but I'm just going to give a couple of examples through each of the forms of some things to think about. So obviously from the main heading section, each of these 4 links takes you into the subsections and the pillars. So looking at ambition and quality firstly, just a note on your 3-year ambition heading. Some examples of these I've seen are extremely simplistic, and I would say this is the one chance you have to be inspirational and exciting. So have a think what the hard-hitting element is that you can say. This is maybe a piece that might feel missing for you from the main application form. This is your chance to give inspiration in each of these 4 boxes throughout. So your 3-year ambition, really think about how it can be, yes, inspirational. What's the change you're going to make? The 12 months priorities box, by contrast, should be more specific and should be a top line summary of some of the things that you're listing below. So you're not trying to say something that's totally new to the breakdown that you have below. Just quickly running through each of them. So in the ambition and quality section, the skills development is ultimately art form and project development. So this is probably the stuff that should be the most easy or that you're most used to writing about in the past. People and representation, we would say, is fundamentally diversity. So thinking about EDI and change that you're going to make from a diversity point of view, particularly, again, thinking about that breakdown from audiences, staff and board. The planning section may in some cases be hard in this. This is probably something that you've already been doing for a while in your organization. And if you've been doing this well, this might be difficult to bring about further change, but there's always a chance for constant self-improvement. And so this section in particular might be one to think about, how can we already build on the success that we have in this area? And finally, tools and monitoring. So you can see I've just put in audiences, staff and board as a bit of a provocation. So in particular, when you're thinking about the ranges and types of value that Caroline was talking about, those 8 types of value, thinking about not just intrinsic or economic, but the baselines that you have perhaps set for different types of value and how you can monitor and evaluate change. Environmental responsibility is one that is perhaps new to be talked about in such a way. And really the important thing here is to think about, again, not just the journey that you're taking your audiences on or how green your building is, but also the transformation that you're going to see in staff and board understanding, learning and unpacking of carbon literacy. From some things to think about, so skills development, just have a think how you're going to unpack not just a single staff training course over the course of a year, but training throughout your organisation. And we'd really recommend that perhaps on people and representation, this could be a chance to talk about exceptional collaboration you could do. This could be with Julie's bicycle, the example that's given in the template of the Arts Council form, but it could be with a local university or a local collaborative network. I know Sales on the call today, so Sustainable Art in Leeds, a similar thing. Who is someone that you can perhaps collaborate with to bring about real change for the organisation and help you move through to become a more environmentally sustainable organisation? The planning section here isn't just about policy. So a green policy is fantastic, but this is also about an environmental action plan. How are you going to reduce carbon? And what's the journey that you'll take your audiences, staff and board on to see that transformation? And then finally, the tools and monitoring section. If you've written this section already and have only written about recycling, I'm afraid you're doing it wrong. There is baselines that need to be set that look at an organizational level of carbon, but also perhaps look at the journey that you're taking your audiences on. Could be literally, for example, I've seen an organization do this well and talking about how cycling will transform the way that people interact with the building and how their staff team also access the building. So just have a think about, again, that baseline and then change. Whizzing through quickly to dynamism. So really dynamism is all about financial development and the unpacking of your operating model and seeing how your 3-year business plan can, in the future, ultimately see something that isn't just a backbone of Arts Council support. And so some of the things to think about in this section are financial development for your staff team, thinking about perhaps income generation changes. That might mean that your staff team need to have more training around commercial opportunities. It could be that you're talking about board level fundraising opportunities for them to feel more upskilled and tooled in becoming better fundraising advocates for you for the future. The people and representation section, this is another great one to talk about collaboration. Perhaps you're interested in working with a certain training provider in the future or a local network. Maybe you want to work with Achates in the future to help you unpack this one. The planning section is really about taking your business plan and talking about how you're going to specifically move your business plan forward on an action point of view. So rather than saying you have a business plan, thinking about the culture change that you're going to create in your organization. This could be through policy, but again, really thinking about the KPIs that are attached to your business plan. So it's not purely vision, but it's very much more about specifics. And then finally, tools and monitoring. There's a lot in dynamism about data and capture technology as relevant. This could be that you're using a CRM, so a customer relation management system. That could be Spectrix, Tessitura. It could be Excel done very well. It could be that you're connecting into audience finder tools. Just have a think about what are the specific monitoring devices that you're using to ensure that data is excellent and you're able to communicate change. And if you don't currently have that, then it's communicating how you will set those baselines and then in turn see change happen. Finally, inclusivity and relevance. Ultimately, this section is all about diversity, and in particular, diversity, again, across audiences, staff and board. So firstly, skills development. Really, this is about thinking about EDI from volunteers to staff all the way through to your board. And thinking about how equality, diversity and inclusivity should be at the heart of everything you do. But remembering that this section, the investment principles plan, is all about specifics, not about general vibes and feelings. People and representation, hopefully this section should be obvious. So this is the representation section of the representation chapter. Planning. Again, this is a note that this is about action. So unpacking your strategy through a lens and focus of action plans. If you have various policies like an anti-racism policy, this would be a really great time to talk about it or talk about implementing one. And then finally, tools and monitoring. So this is about data capture that can help inform your change. How will you set baselines and measure those baselines against perhaps national or local statistics that will help you to see and monitor if you are having impact and changing the diversity and makeup of your organization? The final thing just to say on the investment principles plan is that really this is all about, I think the word that I keep using is the buzzword change. So thinking about the people that interact with your organization, from your audiences through to your audience groups, so people that you perhaps work with in volunteer capacities or who access programs of support you have, as well as your staff team and board. And rather than thinking about this as what you, the organization, will benefit from Arts Council funding, it's more about thinking how you can be the channel through which Arts Council funding reaches those beneficiaries. If you continue to ask yourself that question, what is the change that we're bringing about? How are we helping the Arts Council to live their vision? You should stand a great chance.
Great, thanks so much, Fiona. That's really clear and great advance at the end there. I mean, I really love the thought of these different principles really being sort of almost overlapping circles in the Venn diagram. They should be complementing each other, but equally you're referring to each other, but you're not just repeating the same thing over and over. So really helpful, much appreciated. So Matthew is our Director of Recruitment and also Organisational Change. So we thought it was really worthwhile asking Matthew to say a few words about governance, because it's such an important aspect of the form. And equally, we know that the implications, the responsibilities of governance in charity law have changed so much in recent years. So Matthew, if you wouldn't mind saying a little on this point, it'd be really appreciated. Still on mute there, Matthew.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Fiona. Actually, a lot of what I'm going to say carries on directly from what Fiona has just said. And the first important point about governance is in terms of those investment principles and making sure that your board are signed up to those and that are fully involved. From a very practical and operational perspective, that might be that you have champions that look at each individual investment principle and report to the board after discussing those with the executive team, or you might have a separate subcommittee looking overall at the investment principles that in turn reports to the board. Do express that in the narrative. That's very important. As Caroline says, there's a renewed and quite in-depth focus from Arts Council England on governance. And I think the most important thing to say about that is, firstly, be honest where you are at the moment in terms of your board and your senior management team. And I think leadership is the best way to look at this. They are looking at both in terms of inclusion and representation. And the second is in terms of inclusion and diversity, consider what are the most important protected characteristics and or socioeconomic backgrounds for your organisations and the communities you engage with and you represent, and how that relates to your wider leadership. This could well be global majority in terms of a protected characteristics. And for many of you, it will be. But equally, it could also be equality, disability, socioeconomic background, particularly when looking at many of those levelling up areas which correspond to many of the so-called red wall areas. If your leadership is already representative of your audiences and communities, that's wonderful, and you have the skills and experiences that you need to deliver the investment principles, do say so, be very clear in saying so, and describe how you got there and how you plan to stay there. For example, you might have a plan around succession for senior board members and senior executive team members. If they are not, if your board and leadership is not representative, don't make excuses. Acknowledge where the gaps are, again, both in terms of skills and experience and in terms of protected characteristics and other backgrounds that are relevant to your work, audience and creatives, and talk about how you will change. If you are, for example, underrepresented in a particular community of interest, it's not a question of finding someone who fits that community. It's looking at the skills you need, having an open and accessible process, but with positive action to encourage applicants from that community. So there's a whole host of practical methods to do this, to cover both that open and accessible application and taking positive action. It could be through targeting groups and individuals, but also while ensuring a fair and unbiased approach. And we're working with a number of clients at the moment where we're looking at various degrees of anonymized applications. So for example, having an entirely anonymous cover letter at the start of the application process, which also gives applicants the opportunity to say if they meet a certain protected characteristic, and only once an interview shortlist has been created, bringing in CVs. So it's the method and how you make change that is important. Board process is also hugely important. So detailing regular items on your board agendas, what subcommittees you have, the makeup of those subcommittees, and the importance of that, and ensuring you have the skills and experience in there. And also away days, and the fact that away days are for either reaffirming existing strategy or looking at new strategy, but it's definitely worth detailing all of that. And finally, a little word on memorandum and articles or your governing document. Just a very sort of practical point. Grantium automatically uploads whatever governing document you've got there. So please, firstly, do make sure it's the most up-to-date one. Secondly, if it's not been up-to-dated for example, over a decade, or it's not fit for purpose, don't try and rush one through before the 18th of May deadline. State that it is, state what processes you're going to ensure that your governing document is going to be updated and is going to be fit for purpose. That's all from me. Very happy to take more questions on governance, but I'll hand back to Caroline. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. That's really appreciated. And whilst the governance is obviously embedded across the process, we thought it was really worthwhile getting Matthew's expertise on this, and it's really valued. I mean, I'm really struck by the fact that it is so important within this process to state that, for example, you're diverse-led, but equally that the distinction of diversity is beyond protected characteristics. Socioeconomic, which isn't usually a protected characteristic, is included, which I'm very pleased by. But it is interesting, you've got to be super clear about these points. And I think your idea, Matthew, of not apologising or sort of hiding behind that, but just really stating what you're going to do about it, is just so important. So thank you for that. As I've mentioned, Deborah very sadly isn't well today, so I'm going to take you through some pointers on the financial template. And what I wanted to do here was just go through what we're trying to achieve with these financial documents. Obviously, if you've got specific queries about how you present certain things, do put those in the chat and we'll try and address them at the end. So I think the first thing to say is that whilst the financial templates might be largely reminiscent of the CRF forms, they're not identical. And ACE did issue a new version of the financial template after the initial release of documents. So if you downloaded it at the beginning, make sure you've got the very up-to-date one. Arts Council has suggested they're expecting the same ratio of applicant to grantee that we saw during the recent capital round, and that was 20-1. Now, there are 830 NPOs in the portfolio at the present time, so it doesn't take you a great deal of maths to figure out they're expecting something in the region of 16,000 applications if that's the case. So I think what we can really read from this, and we've certainly heard people have been advised, is that there is going to be a degree of AI algorithmic process filtering applications at the initial stage. And I would suggest to you that the finance templates is one of the places where the algorithm will be looking for simple things that enable it to weed out applications, as they're going to have to do before they really focus in. So the first thing we wanted to do really was to think about where some of those obvious trip hazards might lie. The guidance suggests organisations aim to show a small surplus at the end of the investment period. Now, we know that many of you will have projects that span financial years and may have a dip in income, which is then rectified at the end of the process. So we don't think that's problematic in its own right, but obviously, if you can avoid that, if you've just got a little bit of a deficit in a year, you might want to just think about balancing out your income just to eradicate that if it is avoidable. So look really carefully. I think that if you can find that break-even point, find other ways to address it. The next thing that we really want to talk about, which we've seen as a common issue, is reserves. Now, reserves are really crucial. They're really crucial, as we all saw during the pandemic, and really important in the period of financial uncertainty that we've got going forward. So it's important to consider whether your reserves were topped up from Culture Recovery Fund. Did you apply for that? And if so, did you use that money in that way, or have you already spent it? Have you maintained that position? You may want a note in a section such as dynamism, if you haven't, to explain why. And if it's not advisable to ask for a new grant or an uplift, if your budget looks like you're essentially putting that money into reserves, that wouldn't be a good argument to make to ACE. So just think really carefully about, have you got enough reserve? Do you look sustainable? But are you also seen to be generating a growing reserve yourselves, as opposed to relying on ACE to do something perhaps they've already funded you for in the past? ACE issued new guidance on reserves as part of the CRF process, which was 3 months of turnover. It was very interesting that they did that as a way of sort of dealing with the breadth of situations of organisations who are asking for support. But most organisations are still following the Charity Commission's guidance and aim to maintain around 3 months of operating costs. I would encourage you to think about the reserves in terms of your ambition and how you can contextualise the decision you have made around your reserves in that regard. And as I say, particularly pertinent coming out of lockdown, thinking about pandemic, and exploring with your staff and trustees a reserves policy that really reflects your ambitions, and coming back to Matthew's point, making sure that's up to date as well. What can you accrue over this period, and how that can help you deliver your ambitions in changing circumstances in the period of ongoing uncertainty, and making this monitorable as an amount that is updated on a regular basis. So it might be something that goes into some of your notes in terms of how you're dealing with your reserves, if that's a really key issue you're looking at. And of course, this is particularly important if you're looking at a step change of activity and a massively increased turnover as a result of coming into the portfolio. The next area I want to cover is voluntary income or fundraising. Firstly, ask yourselves what proportion of your income is coming from where at the moment. So you've got your earned income, you've got your voluntary income, your fundraising income, and you've got your ACE grant that you're projecting. We'd suggest that you start by looking back. What's your tracked record between the earned and the fundraising, and potentially from ACE, National Lottery project grants as well? And what does this track record tell you, and how does it inform the figures you project over the next 3 years, over the 3 years of the process? It's more difficult to show higher targets here if you haven't got a track record in fundraising. It needs to look believable. So don't be tempted to just simply deal with it by putting those problems at that door, by putting targets aren't achievable, because that presents a risk that you don't want and the ACE will spot. So don't be overambitious, but equally you should have income in each of these areas. And if your main earned income at the moment is just tickets, then you need to show that you have plans to diversify in the dynamism section of the investment principles. You want to think about that balance of income across the different areas, the commercial, the voluntary, and the statutory, the ACE income. I think that if ACE is more than a third, you've got to really ask yourself, are you just looking to be far too dependent on them? It's not going to be something they welcome. ACE don't want organisations to be reliant on them. They want them to be dynamic, earning income, raising it, and them essentially playing that magic role of enabling really impressive quality work to happen in a deep way in communities. So think about how you're positioning your ask against your peers here. Think about that algorithm. If you're going to ask for more than 30%, then we think really look carefully about the key role that you're going to be playing in terms of ACE delivering in priority places and to support diverse-led organisations and practices. Is there really an argument that can be made there? Certainly, I've sat in ACE meetings around the NPO process where once they've realised that applicant organisation is diverse-led and in a priority place, the ratio that they were willing to consider shifted. So you've got to be really honest with yourself about where you sit in the portfolio in that regard. Secondly, think carefully about where you're representing your income. A lot of the forms that I've looked at, people haven't really been putting some of the income in the right places. So we see sponsorship being attributed as commercial, and that should go into fundraising. That should be a subline under fundraising. Similarly, commissioning income from one of your peer organisations isn't voluntary, that's earned income. So statutory is all forms of governmental income, councils, HE, FE, lottery funders, that's under voluntary income, that's statutory. So just think really carefully about whether you're putting your income in the right place, because often we've seen that ACE has ended up being too big a form of income because of the way that income has been distributed, and your balance of income may be better than you think. One of the things that we've noted with a number of organisations as a result of COVID is that staffing costs are a really low proportion very often of turnover as people have cut back and then not replaced staffing. Does your organisation look sustainable? Is it sustainable? Is one of the key questions you should be asking yourself, because risk, without doubt, will be one of the key factors ACE will be considering, and you should be too. I also want to say that if you're using consultants, and obviously you might want to explain why that's the case, why you're doing that rather than staffing, etc. And just making sure that if you're taking that route, completely valid in lots of cases, but you want to be clear as to why you're taking that approach. Interestingly, one of the anomalies that you can take with this form as opposed to a CRF form is that you can split out staffing and programme staffing costs in the subheadings. So if you feel your staffing costs are too high and too great a proportion, that might make that a little easier to manage. Tax relief is an area which we've had a number of queries about, and whether that's for music or theatre, that should come into income within the year in the earned income section. So, under statutory income. I think the key point at this stage is, what are you trying to show ACE in your financial spreadsheets? That you're a well-run and sustainable organisation, that you manage risk, that you develop and maintain a diverse set of income streams and have plans to extend them, and that you're doing all you can to generate income from as many sources as possible. This last point, of course, links to the dynamism section that Fiona's talked about, and ACE will be expecting to see all income outside of ticket sales alone. All organisations need to be earning income outside of ticket alone, and if you're not already doing that, having plans to do so. So you're not dependent on ACE, but ACE will help you drive quality and impact in an ethical way. And lastly, you'll of course be striving to demonstrate ambition, which is exactly right, but do also think carefully about resources. Just because your staff team is lean doesn't mean it's better. Be realistic about what you need. So finally, I'm going to hand over to Helen, who's going to take us through the application form itself. Thanks, Helen.
Caroline. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to spend some time looking at the main NPO applications with you. As you'll have seen, the character count for answering these questions is tight, and you will need to use the space to draw an arc for your 3-year ambition, which links to the rest of your NPO application, and thinking about your activity plan in particular, which of course only details the first 12 months of the investment period. This series of questions from ACE will ask you to both look back and forward, providing detail whilst keeping your responses brief to make the case for why your work responds to and delivers Let's Create for the benefit of your community and audiences, whilst also demonstrating your track record of high quality, accessible work which merits public investment. So let's look first to the question number 1, thinking about your mission and purpose. This question is asking you to describe your overall mission and purpose for all of the work that you do. It will likely be drawn from your constitution, your business plan, and may even be publicly available on your website. What's important here is that you express why your mission and purpose enables your work to be creative or deliver cultural activity, and as a result, what your work achieves through that. It may be that your mission or purpose is the summary headline of your organisational theory of change, if you have one. And in answering this question, it's also important to think about any partnerships that you have and why collaboration and partnerships are core to delivering your organisational work. Thinking about question number 2, which focuses on access and excellence, here you need to think about how and why your work is high quality and how this has been demonstrated in the past, particularly thinking about the last 5 years. Have you been ambitious in that 5-year period, and has there been a step change in your work? How has this resulted in significant outputs and outcomes, and how are these relevant to how you work now? Again, if you have a theory of change in place, this detail can likely be drawn from there. Again, are there relevant partnerships which have amplified your work and made it high quality in that period? And can you include any media or peer reviews which recognise the difference your work has made? In particular, think about how changes during and as a result of the pandemic might have added to the quality of your work. You will then need to draw this evidence back to the Let's Create outcomes. How are they aligned? You will also need to outline the audiences that engage with your work and detail why your programmes and the activities that you do are specific to and representative of your community. Do you have statistics for how your audiences have engaged with your work in recent years, and what does that data demonstrate? Also outline how you attract audiences or represent a community that doesn't usually engage with publicly funded culture. As this question focuses on access, you will also need to think about any additional measures you have in place to welcome audiences to your work. This might include the provision for access needs or platforms to welcome and involve underrepresented voices within your work. You'll also need to briefly refer to your governance and leadership and how they represent the community that you serve, or how they represent your approach to widening access, and how they represent a well-run organisation meriting public investment. Now, the next question, of course, focuses on governance in more detail, especially the processes and practices in place. So this is a light touch reference to particular notable individuals who bring specific backgrounds and experience to raise the accessibility and excellence of your work. Now, the next question focuses on governance, which of course Matthew has given us a really good overview to. So some of this might be repeating that detail, but just in the context of that question, this question represents ACE's increasing focus and scrutiny on boards and governance and their ability to lead and be responsible for public money. You will need to refer to your constitution and governing document, and you will need to refer to your board and senior management, and again, build the evidence for why they represent your community and bring experience and expertise to your work. Outline why your governance functions are effective. Do they ensure a strong financial position through their scrutiny? And what oversight mechanisms ensure funder agreements are managed and met? Give information about how your board will monitor and report on any NPO funding, and detail what process is in place to ensure this happens. You can also refer here to the investment principles and how your board recognises that these are part of their monitoring of any funding given through the NPO. You will also need to outline how the board is planning to strengthen its future position, what recruitment planning is in place, and what subcommittees could strengthen your approach to future governance. You will also need to refer to any procedures you have to manage any conflicts of interest between your board and your wider work. Looking ahead to question number 4, which asks you to think about your planning for the 3-year investment period, your activity plan, and how this aligns with ACE's Let's Create outcomes. This question is principally linked to your activity plan and the Let's Create outcomes you have identified your work will deliver. You will need to draw an arc of your planning for the full 3-year investment period, which links to your activity plan, which of course only outlines detailed activities for the first 12 months. Think about your wider planning, both through the 3-year period and in terms of specific activities, and link these back to ACE's outcomes. You'll need to outline what difference your work will make. And again, your theory of change will be relevant here. And you need to think particularly, how will you measure that success? Where relevant, some organisations will need to include additional detail on an uplift in investment they're requesting. We recommend only briefly introducing this additional investment here, as there's an additional question further in the process where you can give further details. We should also say, since there's been an update to the NPO application process, there isn't an obvious place within the application questions where you should say, if you tick the box indicating that you would consider moving out of London. We'd recommend, if you have ticked that box and that's relevant to you, putting some brief narrative about that within this question here. And finally, thinking about the uplift question, where that's relevant to you. What we have recognised through the work that we're doing with our clients at Achates is that a number of organisations are asking for an uplift, so we know that this will be competitive. Where this is relevant to you, you can outline specific detail about what that uplift will look like if you're requesting one in this narrative section. You will, of course, have briefly referred to this in the previous question and also within your 12-month activity plan, but what you now need to do is look at your 3-year outcome plan and where that uplift will be applicable. The most important thing to think about if this section is relevant to you is to outline how your uplift is scalable. You'll also need to think about how any uplift demonstrates additionality to your work and therefore makes the case for how additional investment not only brings benefit to your work, community and audiences, but also enables ACE to better deliver their outcomes. Does the uplift represent a step change for your organisation? And if it does, how does this link back to better delivery of ACE's outcomes? And particularly, you will need to think about how any uplift requested represents good value for money.
Great, thank you, Helen. That's really helpful. And I know that's a little bit whistle stop, but I think it's really valuable insight in terms of managing a process which we need to communicate an awful lot of information in a very few word counts. And of course, we know that Grantium, as ever, will mean that we really do have to stick to that. Just want to add one further thing, which I don't think we've covered, which is you should assume that ACE is also going to look at your website. So do ensure that that's fully up to date. And as Matthew's already said, think about those governance documents, etc. Think about your website, just think about how you're presenting yourself in the public domain. So that brings us to the end of our exploration of the application process itself, and we're now going to move to the Q&A aspect of the session. We've got a couple of questions coming in, and I think the first one, which I'm going to ask you, Fiona, if you would comment on, is there's a big focus on boards taking responsibility for the investment principles in particular. Have you got any tips for how to best weave this into the investment principles plan, please?
So I'm going to be really hopefully helpful and just show, if that's all right, an example of this that I've just quickly written in summary to that. So just showing you my template organization and investment principles plan. So I suggested initially that you break down your investment principles plan to perhaps look at audiences, staff and board throughout. So in your 3-year ambition, you might put, for example, how the board is taken on a journey to reduce the carbon footprint of the organization. Your 12-month priorities might highlight that your board is receiving carbon literacy training. And so looking down at skills development, you might partner with an organization to provide carbon literacy training for your board of trustees, ensure your new board members are coached in environmental policy, perhaps. Matthew talked in governance about the power of champions or on boards rather than just subcommittees, perhaps. So rather than needing to create 100 subcommittees, you could have individual board members responsible for areas. So perhaps a board champion in environmental could help you to develop your green policy, ensure environmental action plans are overseen, not just at a staff level. That in turn could help unpack your strategy so that you've got action plan that's overseen at a board level. And finally, you could have a think about in the tools and monitoring, perhaps your board is the ones that at quarterly board meetings are overseeing and reporting on the change and metrics that you've set as part of your KPI and benchmarking.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. Hope that starts to answer that question. Just really a call for any questions, anything you want to ask us. Obviously, we'll close the session now if there's no more questions from the floor, but this is your moment for a bit of free advice if there's anything anybody wants to ask. Great, Victoria, I think that's a no from you. I think no more questions. So it sounds like you're all in good place and making good progress on your applications. We really want to wish good luck to you all, but also know that it's going to be very competitive. So also think about the other ways in which you can deliver your planned actions, particularly if you're an applicant organisation the first time, and how you might want to build your breadth of model if you're not successful in being accepted into the portfolio this time. So my thanks to all the brilliant Achates team for their time and insights this morning and for the good work you've been doing seeing clients through the NPO process. You've worked really long days, you've worked holidays and through sickness. Fiona, Matthew, Deborah, hopefully you'll feel much better. And Helen, a question. Fiona, you can obviously see that question. Can we add lines to the budget? No, it isn't possible to do that with this form as it was with CRF. Oh, now the questions are coming. Do we have any advice about direct activity versus education and outreach? Well, I think just obviously that's a very big question. If you're asking about the balance of that activity, then obviously one of the things that we're really conscious of is thinking about your audience groups and making sure that you're serving them well. We always at Achates talk about a triangle of art, audiences and money. If you're doing very high art, which is attracting a paying audience in particular, then you're probably going to want to really think about reaching some diverse groups and making sure you have the balance there. If you're primarily working in a community and you're primarily thinking about that, you really want to make sure that your quality and rigor is there. So you want to express that across the form, but obviously the investment principles are really how you position yourselves in terms of that balance of engagement and performative art, if you like. Okay, now I'm coming to a couple more questions. Can there be a bit more unpacking on question 4 of the form? Helen, is there anything else you want to say on that? I'll give you a moment to open that up. There's a question here on the activity plan for outputs and targets measures. How many characters do you recommend, given there are no limits? I've been trying to stick that without visible, without expanding the box. Yes, I think that's the approach that I would take. It is really interesting that that is the one section of the form that it has got no character limits on it. And we would say, essentially, don't run under what's visible in the box. I would also say that if you are using that form in terms of expressing current and uplift, really you want to use the majority of that form to express current. You really only want to indicate how it would be an impact philanthropy-based uplift, scalable, if you're using it in that way, in really simple terms. So yeah, absolutely try and stick to the box. I think there's that's the intention of the form. Helen, anything more we can say on question 4?
Yeah, another thought from me is actually how, whilst the activity plan looks at your first 12 months of the proposed investment period, what question 4 gives you a real chance to demonstrate and outline to the Arts Council is actually over that 3-year period, what change will happen in your organisation. It's a really detailed 12-month activity plan, but actually by the end of 2026, how will your work have changed? And I think that gives you some space to outline that. In particular, thinking about the outcomes, it might be that for that first year of the funding period, you're particularly closely aligned to 2 of the outcomes. Are you reaching to think about one of the third by the end of 2026, or will the balance of that outcome have changed? So I think it's giving some thought to that.
Great, thanks, Helen. That's really helpful. Got a question here, which is about how strictly should we stick to the planning figure we have been given to express our ambition? So my answer, and can it be a different amount you ask for in each year? So to answer the second part of that first, no, you can't ask for a different amount in each year. You really should probably be sticking to that planning figure in the ask. And then if you're asking for more than that, you treat that as an uplift and say, you've given us a planning figure of 150,000, but we'd really like 200,000. And here's the value we can drive for you in doing so. And that's where those arguments about value come in. But no, it should be assumed in your budget that it's 150,000 on that basis throughout. It doesn't vary. If you look at how NPO works and how people are granted, it's always the same amount, which is, of course, why that point about how your income may dip when you've got projects that take you into deficit in a particular year in terms of your balance sheet, you're just really managing that process. So it's flat across. Got another question here, which is about, is there a clear distinction between target and success measures? I'm treating your targets as essentially the numerical outputs of people that you're reaching, etc. So 100 school children that you're particularly engaging, for example. The success measures I would treat as the change you're bringing about. And that's where the types of value that you're driving really come about, linked to the elements. So really, can you prove the elements through the change that you're bringing about? And as I say, as a sector, we tend to be a lot better at monitoring than we are at evaluation. And that's often because we don't have baseline data. So it's really, really important to make sure that you can say where you are now, so you can talk about the percentage change that you're bringing about and those success measures. And as Fiona said, I think just making sure they're outward facing, they're not inward facing. How are you contributing to the portfolio? I think when you're thinking about this, one of the things that's really striking is, for the first time, through the elements that you're ticking, ACE has got a series of categorizations that it's going to be able to count everybody's outputs, targets, and success measures against, and we'll be able to say how many of those it's funding across the country. And that's why I think this really applies to NLPG now as well. They're going to really be looking at how that comes together across the portfolio and across other funding sources and grant programs as well. Great. That was a flurry of questions at the end there. Anything else that's coming in from the floor that we want to ask? Okay. In which case, I think that, again, just really thanks to all the brilliant Achates team. This is a pro bono session. People are giving their time, so really appreciated. And I know everybody on the webinar really appreciates your time, as I do. Please don't forget that Achates is here for all your strategy, fundraising, recruitment and training needs. And if you aren't already a subscriber, make sure you sign up to our mailing list for opportunities like this. So take care, good luck. And if you're an Achates client, you will receive an invite to our post-NPO drinks, and we hope to see you there. Take care, everyone.